I think there are a lot of people just entering right now, as far as I can tell, which is great. And so our first round today is about constraints. Do they fuel creativity or not? It's a discussion topic which made us think about a lot about life, I think, as well in our preparations. And for discussing this topic today, we have with us Henrik Wiberg, sorry for that. He's a senior product designer at Klarna. Then we have Isabelle Silfver, which is a product owner at Klarna, and Melissa Pickering. Hope I'm pronouncing your names right. Just correct me after if I'm not. Who's a product strategy lead at Lego Education. And every one of them will pitch for about 5 minutes their thoughts. Then they will go into a debate for like 15 minutes. And then we will invite you to join the stage and please tell us what you think about the subject of constraints. So first I would say, Henrik, let's go. Let's do this.
Thank you.
I will remove the screen sharing. Yeah.
Do you please confirm that you can see my screen?
I do.
Okay. I'm going to talk about constraints then. And I'd argue that constraints have its place when we know what we want to build and need to figure out how to build it. But to start things off, I'll say a few words on constraints in general. Constraints act as boundaries for us, and they can be both naturally occurring in nature or imposed upon us, either by law or simply through agreements with our peers. Constraints can also be seen as problems of their own. There are often ways around constraints, and if you have a lot of time, perhaps you could work your way through your constraints rather than around them. An example of working your way around constraints is could be found in law. For example, companies that come up with very creative tax evasion schemes to avoid certain aspects they feel constrained by. But today, we're mostly interested in the constraints that we find in our workplace that we need to follow when building a product, such as budgets, backwards compatibility, maybe expectations from stakeholders, customers, or technology choices. And already I've mentioned a lot of constraints, and I haven't even begun talking about building anything actual. And it might not sound intuitive to add more constraints at this point, but that's actually just what we need. When starting off with a new project, I don't fear adding more constraints to the already substantial pile of constraints we just covered. And I haven't even mentioned time yet, not cost, nor quality, though those being the factors which we most often end up balancing. I was thinking I'll walk you through how I use constraints to optimize for quality. And like I said, when building a product, you typically factor in time and how much value you get out of that time. So I start off by trying to design solutions that are as simple and minimalist as possible. So if it's a new project, for example, if we were to make a landing page for it, I try to make do with as little as possible. One size of body text, one title, one button. This approach helps me identify problems in a solution, because when I run into a problem caused by these constraints, it's easier to realize what I need to adapt in terms of constraints to move forward and make the solution better. Sometimes you then modify your constraints, for example, by adding a fourth element. When I do this, I find that I get a better, more solid understanding of the explicit purpose and the why of all the building blocks in our product. This is, of course, a fine balancing act of aesthetics and functionality. But when done well, I find that it enables a lot of speed and quality. Speed and quality to me becomes a byproduct of the circumstances of designing something under heavy constraints. It leads to solutions that are made up of as few elements as possible, meaning that when we're building the product, it's simpler for those building it. It's less to explain to others. It's less to understand for the customers. It's less that can go wrong, and the creative work becomes much faster because given the limited set of decisions that are left to be made. Because of this, we can't reach infinitely many outcomes. This way of working becomes efficient creatively because it allows you to focus on the solution, on different ways of composing your elements, on understanding your audience. The time spent having to contemplate whether a button would be any better with rounded corner or if its typeface might be better in bold simply becomes time you can spend on other things. Of course, those details have their place in time, but they're not as important for good design as we might think. I find that in the end, a good design is really a good layout, a good composition. Good design has a good rhythm, much like how classical music is composed. The notes themselves are not as cherished as how they are composed, such as by Mozart or Bach. Too much choice simply stifles creativity because there's no clear way to go. There's no path of least resistance. If every path is just as good, there's nothing to bounce your decision against. So how do we really consider what's good then? In the end, I would just like to say that constraints can help creativity speed up by eliminating decisions we don't need to make, such as whether going bold or medium on a typeface. Constraints can help us build with quality and speed because we simply have less elements to care for, less of everything. Constraints can also help us foster a culture in between ourselves because we all then would adhere to the same rules of what we're doing. It's much like how laws and codes of conduct works in different cultures in society. So my conclusion after reflecting on this topic is that it's useful when you're figuring out how to do something, but not necessarily as useful for figuring out novel new ideas. To do that, at least one constraint needs to be broken. And that was a wrap for me.
Henrik, I would say we just continue with Melissa, who also has a few thoughts on constraints. Yeah, and then
yep.
Taking notes here a lot.
Yeah. So can you see my screen?
Yeah,
we can.
Cool.
Good. So in LEGO, we support endless creativity with building creativity and building for kids with our experiences, engaging and igniting kids' imaginations. And at first glance, it seems a little bit strange because how can there be so much opportunity with essentially a lot of the same types of bricks? They're more or less the same sizes and maybe come in a variety of colors, but they're not all that different, and they're all basic rectangular pieces like I have here. And it seems like that would over constrain creation. And if you had a number of kids and adults even building from these same types of pieces in what we call free building, so not following instructions, you would think that we would end up with a lot of the same looking end results. But I'd like to share with you today, you know, when we had the luxury of doing in-person events, one of my favorite activities was something that involved really just 6 bricks, as you see here. And I have them here in my hand. And the challenge in 30 seconds would be for everyone to build a duck. And 6 bricks, 2 colors, pretty basic shapes. And it seems like pretty much everyone would have a duck looking about the same. But in all the times that I've done with different audiences, whether it's 20 people or 100 people, it goes without fail that you have many different looking bricks or ducks, I would say. And so how can this be? Because it seems like this problem is I would say overly constrained. You don't have that many pieces to work with. They're basically the same colors. But this is where we say that we're actually allowing for creativity. And the problem here is that we've constrained it in a very intentional way. So this whole challenge of building a duck, it's done by design, right? Everyone has a general picture of what a duck looks like, so they have a general understanding of an end state. However, everyone has their own perceptions and experiences to bring to the table that then guides the how to get that to that end state. And that means that once you look at then the how, you get a number of different creations that they all kind of look like ducks, but they have each individual's creative take on a duck. So just to say that it's not just by chance that these designing for creativity is done in a way that just allows for anything to happen, that the constraints are done in such a specific way to allow for solution diversity like you see here. And that's all.
Thank you, Melissa. A little different take on this constraint subject, actually, I would say. And last one is Isabelle. You ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can you see my presentation? Can you confirm, Henning, if you can see it?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, brilliant.
A lot of chat.
Okay, cool. So I was thinking about creativity from more of a holistic perspective and what that means in different ways. We have the space of art, which is more concerned about exploring, expressing ideas that might have more than one meaning and try to provoke feelings in an observer. While design is more about achieving solutions with measurable results, whether it is about a brand or if we're developing a business in a certain way. Or innovation to create quicker and smaller iterations to test, adapt, and challenge the status quo and see what kind of new ground we can break. But for me, I think that, let's see, the constraints are essentially the tools, methods, and problems that we decide to work with in the process, whatever the end goal would be or what we're intending to do with space that we are working within at this point. So as a product manager and previously designer, I've been working a lot with iterations, and something that comes back both through these approaches or this part of the development process, I think, is double diamond. I'm a huge fan of converging and diverging and constantly having reflections and checkpoints about where we are. I think this is something that can go and breathe in multiple iterations until you have something that you really that you feel good with on the market. And even when it is on the market, it's still about learning, reflecting, taking a decision, and then moving on. And essentially that's how we reach new levels and new nuances of our products. So what constraints do I think benefits us in the product process? I did a reflection on how I see this in my own product development with my teams. For instance, when we start and we do a massive discovery, we're opening up to see what does the landscape look like. This, of course, needs to have constraints of time, space, because resources are precious. We need to move forward, especially if we're in a business running on money. And then frame a mission by taking certain decisions, make a reflection point, and then say, okay, we're confident enough to then go into discovery because we have set the scene and we have kind of like more of a frame to work within. So I came up with 3 different things I find is important when you go into this creative process and start to breathe through your double diamonds. I think the intention of when you need to open up and when you need to close needs to be very clear. So essentially the constraints that you're taking on, what do you want to do? So for instance, is it about provoking feelings of pressure to create something? Or is it very rigid constraints? Like Melissa explained before, there was an intention of actually just putting out 6 bricks with eyes and then see, well, the reference is a duck, but what else can it be if we just push our people to, with these constraints, to create something? Or is it about something bigger, like solving the customer problem? Or are we going from another narrative, which is we have a technology that works in a certain way, where can that be applied? So kind of like have a purpose with the constraint that you're putting on and why you want to put it. So for instance, when you go into discovery, you look at you start to investigate who and what are experiencing this, and which of these problems fits within the mission that we want to go on with this. The next thing is what I mentioned before, to keep breathing. So constantly having open up to take in data, get more knowledge, kind of create within the space, and then come back together and each converge to like structure your decision and build new constraints as you open up again, depending on where you are in the process. Looking at this and having like reflection and checkpoints throughout the converging and diversion. For instance, when we start to like frame the mission, we have a scene. Once we've found our problems, started to define them, we build hypotheses. We go into with these hypotheses to build ideas and concept, and then prioritize what is best to do, and then into concretizing these through towards like a first actual delivery and an MVP. The last one I think is really important is alternating the creator, because we're different people, especially if we work in cross-functional teams, and we have come with different expertise and knowledge to the table. So there's also an opportunity to be more free and with less constraints, depending on where we are in the process of what we want to achieve together. So the data and the knowledge that is brought in at different stages of the process also becomes our constraints in a way. So for instance, at the beginning, as a product manager, you work with subject matter expertise and key stakeholders in the beginning. I think someone is not on mute right now. Okay, thank you. In the beginning, to really get as much data as possible and then decide what is actually the most important thing for us to focus on. And then as we move into ideation, design takes more and more participation of what is the experience that we're going to build. And then as that becomes more concretized, engineering takes over and then becomes the creator in the end, where they have more of a freedom to discover technically and create proof of concepts and see, test, iterate. So I see that there is like different hats that we take on throughout, or the creation hat is taken on by different people throughout the process, even though we get more and more defined as we go in solving this problem. So yeah, I would say the process matters. The process has constraints through the tools, methods, and the problems that we choose to approach. It is constant learning. So as we move forward, constraints are also fluid and changes over time. So again, be intentional with the constraints that you're putting. Keep reading through, loosening up constraints and closing them, and then alternate the creator. That's it.
Thank you. Could you leave open the last slide, maybe, Isabelle, just for a minute?
Sure. Give me a sec. This one?
Intentionally keep breathing. Alternate creator. Okay, sorry, I didn't get one. Yeah, thanks. Well, actually, I was thinking a little bit about you and Henrik. I mean, it seems like, okay, I will try to get this started here a little bit about, generally, I think we all have a kind of an agreement that constraints are in a way necessary to get a product created and get into this onwards to the target. Though I see that Melissa kind of had an interesting, to me it felt a bit different though, what was Melissa telling about with this, you have a target, but you have many different possibilities from the starting point to the target and in the middle. And I see a bit of a, and Isabelle, you're putting on a process from the very beginning onwards, and just very, I would say very, very, don't want to call it narrow, but straightforward towards the target. So I would like to ask Henrik, which I think is a bit more free-minded. How do you feel like being in this process right on from the beginning? Is that
the process that Isabelle mentioned?
Yeah.
I like I said in my talk, I think if we're agreeing on what we're supposed to do, it could be useful just to get forward in that sense by following a process like that. I think I would, like my reflection when hearing her talk was that she mentioned that constraints have to be intentional, but I think that creativity could also be created and inspired by constraints, unintentional, just any constraint could achieve a new way of thinking, and that could bring out ideas that perhaps are not obvious if we're just in the purely rational world. And yeah.
Maybe that is a bit of a connection to this free build section of Melissa. I found that very interesting because you're giving like the same start point and the same target for everyone, yeah, on these bricks. But the middle is completely undefined, and you get a lot of these creative different solutions. Would you say that this is, compared to Isabelle's very strong process-oriented approach, would you say that would that be possible if you would pack this duck building into a process which is like very straightforward?
Yeah, my reflection is that that this is the process, like the components, these bricks are part of the process. Mm-hmm. So her point in terms of being intentional. So the designers of this activity, of course, I can't take credit for that. It's I don't know how long it took, but probably quite a long time, right? A lot of times the simplest things often take the longest. But there was a very intentional, and I would say these are the pieces guiding the process that you go through as you're building the as you're completing the challenge to build the duck. So in essence, this is the process.
So I think that's interesting. Or can I say something?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I think like the Lego example is interesting because it's such a limited set of pieces, but you see this broad array of outcomes that you couldn't even predict. Like I personally couldn't create all the variations of ducks that people can come up with. And I think that is such a simple task. And if we look at like having a limited set of components and elements when building a product, the choices in that are so vastly greater than just the Lego pieces themselves. So I think like by having the constraints, even very tough constraints like with Lego, you still see results that are unimaginable. So by like then building a product with even more moving pieces, I think if you want to have any kind of control over that, you need to add constraints to it to simply manage it. With the elements, it's even the people that work with it, maybe components you built in the past, or yeah.
There's just to build on. So actually, and I've observed people, if there's something about creative confidence and being able to get started through a process. And so I've seen kids and adults, more so adults, in front of a place of a number of different, it's like that white space challenge, a number of different, a bin of Lego bricks to do something. And it's hard to get the momentum to get going because it's overwhelming, the possibilities. So the fact actually that there's so few options here, it helps fuel at least get people to get started, to get a little bit of the creative confidence to go through the process. So actually the limit here is part of the intention in designing the process.
Can I build on this point? You mentioned creative confidence, which comes from IDEO, and I'm a huge fan of that whole approach of like really making something to give a very simple model to then allow people to explore within. It still has like very clear frames in a way. Like I think that there's one other method, which is try to draw an apple in as many ways you can, because you can relate to it. And in the duck example now, like you're limited with a set of pieces, which allows you to be vulnerable, but also like push forward, as you say. If you're giving too many options, it might be like, first of all, confusing. It's going to be time consuming, and it's going to be overwhelming, because taking a next decision or just like finding completion in a way, it will feel like I accomplished something. will be very much longer and harder. So it's also very I think from a performance or productivity perspective, the harder constraints, maybe it helps us to move faster, and then like we can iterate as well.
That goes back to designing, back to the double diamonds, right? In terms of even in when you're in the diverging phase, it's still super important to at least have some framework or boundaries around the diverging phase just to get started. There's some questions here in the chat. Should we relate to those in our discussion?
Actually, I'm scanning them and I found one of Daniel, which I liked because he says these options of constraints, they seem to be voluntary. How do you use obligatory constraints like business constraints to fuel creativity? And there was, like, I would say this is connected. Sorry, I can't pronounce the name correctly, probably Jihenska. He kind of poses that constraints are always time, cost, and quality. So there's this triangle in our business, like time, quality, and
yep.
How do you get creative around that?
So just like, I think quality is an outcome, and that time and cost are the what you put in to reach it. And could you repeat the initial question?
Okay. All these constraints we mentioned in our talks, they seem to be voluntary, like we put them on ourselves. But Daniel was asking, how do you use obligatory constraints like business constraints to be creative? How did they fuel your creativity?
Well, I would say that constraints, especially the ones that are obligatory, fuel our creativity. I mean, we have gravity as a constant constraint in everything we do, and it's a lot of ways to fly at the moment. But I mean, so we get creative around what's obligatory. And like I mentioned with tax evasion, that's very creative, I think, given the constraints. And I know in the context that we work in with digital financing at Klarna, we have very many constraints through law. So the products that we can create can't behave and can't function in any way possible. So then through user experience design, we have to find ways around the law to still provide a service that people find useful and that we find useful. So to the very highest extent, the obligatory constraints fuel creativity.
Isabelle, how would you see that? Because you have to design the process for your people, I guess. How do you see those business constraints influencing that?
Yeah, of course, in the end, it's connected to resources, of course, and at the end of the day, creating something that is going to be used by users, and then what does that do so we can fuel new processes as well. Sorry, the question from the beginning, can you rephrase it?
Yeah, sure. It was again, these options, these constraints we put on ourselves are voluntary. We all mentioned in our presentations, and so the question was, how do we fuel our creativity with obligatory constraints, business constraints? And
I think in one way it needs to be, again, like if we continue to choose constraints, how do we fuel with obligatory constraints?
In my head, I was thinking that because you have to go with it, you present the double diamond, and I mean, it can go very free if you say, okay, we open up. It's there can again be a vast collection of ideas, like what we discussed maybe yesterday night even, and now this business constraint comes in. Okay, you have this amount of time, or you have this budget. Or I don't know, you want to reach a certain market segment. Does that kind of actually, do you feel limited by that, or would you say that it's actually even good for your process that you're setting up?
I think that's definitely beneficial for the process in a way where it gives focus to the whole team. I think, just as Henrik mentioned before, like if you have certain constraints when it comes to the business you're in, rather than like starting to diverge into a lot of different industries that you might not be familiar with, you might just dilute your resources and the time, and you might not end up with something that is delightful and useful for the user. So constraining in terms of the industry, what you are, where and what you are spending your money on and your time on, definitely needs to come in hand so that the quality becomes higher of the output, I would say.
I'm just reading an answer here by Simon from the chat. Deep diving into business constraints will always free up creativity. Why? Because we only know what we know, and along the process, we definitely learn tons of new things. Is that right?
I definitely agree with this, because I mean, we're starting with a set of data and knowledge at the time, but as like time passes by, new things are being planted into the world. Like new users will be exposed for new services. So, like the iterative process by building, testing, learning will always have to be in handy for us to continue to evolve whatever product it is or design that we're putting out there. So constantly keeping these in has to, like, we need to keep learning and reflecting on what we're putting out there.
Yeah, I think this one actually by is interesting in terms, kind of builds on Isabelle what you're saying in terms of our current realities being a constraint. So we could think about very what we're all dealing with now with the pandemic. Like a year ago this time, we wouldn't imagine some of the number of like going through basically a year of work all remote, and that is kind of, that was all of our, or most of ours, constraints. That was our reality, and so we were sort of constrained with how we work based on that. But then we were sort of forced in this other world over the last year, and now that's kind of, there's no longer a constraint on certain activities in terms of in-person interaction. So I think it's a really good point that our perceived constraints are evolving with time and the market.
Yeah, they're pushing things to yeah, it's true. Yeah, if I think about it like that. Yeah. Sorry, I got lost in my thoughts here. Let's see what else is in the chat, maybe. Oh, Jeff Patton posted something. How do you feel about contradictory or competing constraints? Build what satisfies business stakeholders versus maximizing product outcomes. I can read it again, or I will pin it in the chat so everyone can read it on top.
Do you want to go, Henrik, or can I start?
You can start.
Sure. I think this is a question that I think about a lot, weighing like the user problem and the business goals against each other. In the best of worlds, like these should feed off each other. Like we find a problem, we find a space to act within, to create a business and like actually put a product out there that is desirable, and we have like a full cycle of actual mutual contribution. But when it comes to stakeholders, they might have different agendas. I have throughout my career been exposed to hard requirements on here is a very important deal that we need to close, and these features needs to be there, while we know what the users are actually desiring to get into the product ASAP. So constantly having the rationale for what is the most important for the user, and continuously have their voice at the table when these things comes up, to justify and then weigh what does this mean in different scenarios. If we only go with improving for the user, are we doing a trade-off, or just like really closing, for instance, a very prioritized need from a stakeholder point of view? I hope that makes sense.
I think that one is tricky because it, just put my perspective on it. I think it's tricky because it sounds like you're not, like in that circumstance, there's not an agreement on what you're building, really. So you have constraints, but you have really different goals with it. And the problem isn't probably not the constraints at this point. It's the whole consensus of what you're really trying to achieve together. Business stakeholders might have one agenda with one responsibility, perhaps to their other stakeholders. Perhaps they have a responsibility to shareholders, and product people might have more direct responsibility to the end user. But somewhere these two entities need to find a mutual ground to see how what you're doing is creating value for really the company as a whole. I mean, the company does function due to having customers, so it could be an education aspect to focus on before considering the constraints.
I have to jump in here. Sorry, I messed up the timing a little bit. We will open up this session for everyone now, and the next session of Strategizer, guys and Pat Keenan, they're going to start in like 4 minutes. Yeah, 4 minutes. So you can either stay with us here, continue discussion on this subject. We will open up the stage to everyone, or in like 4 minutes, 3 minutes, you can join the next session. Yeah. So sorry, Henrik, that I was jumping in there. Some people are actually replying to you in the chat. Simon, maybe you want to come on stage actually and discuss with Henrik live. And I see that we already have 3 more people here. And I think Melissa needs to leave us in a few minutes actually. She's...
You'll leave at 3, so.
Yeah, okay. Well, we will just continue on that discussion anyways. Then I will already say thank you for that. I will just add everyone who's asking for access now to the stage, and then we can continue in a more merry group. Well, can we see that? Put on your cameras, put on your microphones. Don't hide. Simon, you were just asking, is this taking so long actually?
Okay, now it worked.
Ah, cool. Hey.
Sorry. Yeah, I was a little shy because I'm like super dressed up today. I had some bank meetings and in the morning.
After.
Sorry about that.
So you had a comment on Henrik somehow?
Yeah, on both actually. Like I was just thinking about Jeff Patton's statement or his question, and his contradictory and competing constraints. I think like, so I was making the statement of if prioritization is the field of creativity for the product owner, because like, I mean, there's so much in the product owner role, which needs to like, basically I would say creativity is a human inert ability. So we're creative whenever we do anything. But like this prioritization of competing constraints can be really tough. I know it because I was also product owner in a few products with some insurances. And I also know about constraints because insurances also do have tons of constraints. So yeah, so I can relate to both. That's just what I want to say to Henrik with what he's saying and to also what Isabelle is referring to. So yeah, I totally think that constraints are something, what you also already elaborated, I won't repeat. So.
But I mean, just to add on the competing one, I mean, some of the constraints are constraints, but not all constraints are set in stone. Like natural occurrences physically, like gravity is probably set in stone and law might be set in stone, but there's also the opportunity to push through a constraint instead of working around it. I mean, if you have competing constraints and there's general consensus that you don't want to go either way, there's also the opportunity to be creative around how you can eradicate that constraint. if it's, for example, a business constraint, maybe the business has promised something to someone and they need to stick to that. But that's like, there's wiggle room in some ways. And that is also an approach to tackling it. But that's usually the most costly one, because that takes time to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just on what you're saying, at some point the constraints needs to be negotiable. Maybe they are, as Henrik says, like they're rigid in some contexts, but weighing pros and cons or possibilities, we can flex them more as well. But as I said, that takes time and can also be very political depending on the intention and the direction. What do you think about that?
I would agree. Totally. I would say, like, what's the actual purpose of a team that you're building? Is it softening up constraints along the way, or what's the purpose? Is it to get something done quickly, like focusing on productivity, wiggling around and trying to challenge constraints can be something so tiresome and time consuming. That's from my experience, that sometimes creativity gets lost on the way and you're like, whoa, what the hell are we doing? We're just focusing on, this is the direction, and the team is running into this direction, like 2, 3, 4 sprints or something. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, we kind of focused on something too narrow, or one of the team, one person. So yeah, is it important to have something like in the vision or in the mission of a team that sets where creativity is focused on? Like, is that important? So is that already a constraint you have to make so that a team creativity can actually take place? I think that's what I'm kind of asking, because everybody can, like, on an individual level, you can pursue your goal. Like a product owner can run into one direction, and the designer can run into one direction, and developers run into one direction within their constraints. But what's a team's constraint towards productivity? That's also something, right, we have to make, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to formulate what that means. So, I mean, you're taking both like on the sprint level, but it could also be on a vision level. So they both need to have constraints. So for instance, with sprints, we're limited by time and maybe a set of very specific tasks that we need to perform, which has already been decided. But that has a previous stage of like, okay, what are we choosing? And back to the prioritization, how do we, like, what wiggle room do we have? And then decide on like, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. You create a decision point and then you move forward. And then within those frames, you can have creativity within it. So yeah, it's on different levels. And as I mentioned before, we alternate the creator depending on the purpose of what we go in with. So I mean, for instance, in a feature, there's 100 ways to build it from an engineering perspective, while the feature previously might have been designed in 10 different ways before it was decided, okay, this is how we fulfill the purpose.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's like sometimes like when so a team to me is there because someone wants to do something and they can't do it alone, usually. And a part of that is agreeing on what you want to do, I think. And that, before you know what to do, you might be interested in just exploring your ideas. And I think by exploring ideas, an efficient way to discover natural boundaries in what you want to build or the solution you want to make is to try and scale it up. Like a designer could come up with ideas, and by imagining it's a solution for one user might be horrible if it's 1,000. So by pushing the boundaries, you start to see where different ideas and solutions have constraints. And I think the engineers, they do the same. Some ideas they find might be scalable for one person, but if they have 1 million people, it might not be good. So by in that context, perhaps unconstrained exploration, you do, I think, if you push it, discover some natural boundaries, and through them, then you might be able to start figuring out what is actually a reasonable solution. Or you could decide that the solution that isn't feasible engineering-wise requires X, Y, and Z to become feasible. And then you could choose to push through that.
But
like Apple with the iPhone, when they found out a smartphone could have a big screen. You didn't need the keyboard.
That's right. That's a hypothesis.
Yes.
But do you time box? That's a question. Like, does your product owner give you time box when you do explore, or a developer explores? Because I was just thinking on the other side, you know, if you're a business analyst or a product owner, and then you run with different ideas of how you could push a boundary with some stakeholders, I would be really interested. How could that look? You know, have an A/B test with one stakeholder of what kind of idea do you? I mean, you don't come around to a person, and that person will be on the next day will have forgotten what you asked just the day before. So you have only one shot, for example, to push a boundary, a legal boundary for, let's say, something like that, or a product boundary, like which is in the minds of some people who are your stakeholders. So I would agree with designers and developers having their space and needing their space as well to explore and ideate and discover stuff. But how does that look like when you're on a mere communication level with some stakeholders as a product owner making a budget decision? You're not saying, well, we should spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks. What do you like more? You know, what's the how do you test out a stakeholder's commitment?
But I would put it in a perspective. Like, we're in software industry mostly, I think, us in this audience. And I think if you compare that process to someone that is building a bridge, I think you wouldn't be as harsh to the engineers that do the geological research. If you can put a pole in the ocean, for example, they get a much more liberal amount of time to do foundational research on what is feasible and discovering the boundaries, because you typically spend 20, 30 years on that one shot. And I think in software, we're blessed with the opportunity to make a solution that is iterated on 100 times in that time. And we can build a bridge that is a horrible bridge, but gets people across while we're working on the big bridge. And that, I think, that with that perspective, I think it helps a bit how you look at it.
I tend to agree with this, and like, we're all working with hypotheses. You might as well build this horrible bridge and no one ever uses it. So why should you then continue to spend time on building the famous, or like the shiny one? So I think there's big value of or there's a huge value in making everyone get on board with the purpose and the goal of the actual desired outcome of whatever you want to create. And as Henrik said, like, we're in the software business, it's flexible. There's a lot of different ways you can actually build a solution, as long as you know why, and then you can make it super scrappy or invest tons of money depending on how you strategize the work. So I think there's tons of value of bringing everyone together to really get you on board with the constraints that you need to set, whether it's time, budget, or if it is long-term value, that needs to be understood by all parties involved. Even if that is time consuming, I find that's like, that transparency and alignment gets you very far.
Natalia was actually asking a question in the chat, which is kind of going this, not sure if like with the last comments, but a few comments before she was.
Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering what your thinking is about whether there are good and bad constraints, and how important it is to actually set the right constraints in order to make sure that they fuel and not limit creativity, or maybe there isn't such a thing as bad constraints. I would be interested in your thoughts.
I will add something from my own experience here. Maybe this gets thoughts running, but because I actually feel very stressed out by constraint of time. If there's, you know, these design thinking, you have these very short time box creative sessions. They just stress the hell out of me, and I can't produce anything. For me, that is a bad constraint, like stressful time amounts. So that I would say is very bad, and actually I don't like that approach very much. So every time a session like that comes up, I'm kind of backing out.
I think bad can be good in that sense, because I think as designers, or when you're ideating, you're often trying to pursue this idea of the perfect idea or solution.
Yeah.
And it doesn't exist. And with time and being forced to take that decision in a design thinking workshop, you're, I think, more you get more comfortable with the idea that even something that is instinctively bad can still render something that can surprise you. And it can also turn out that it's wrong, but it's very difficult to evaluate anything in that stage of a design thinking workshop. I mean, often if you have one idea or someone presents one idea, you see your interpretation of it. But like with the Lego pieces, there's a lot of interpretations of a lot of things that we might not see initially.
So you would actually say there's no good or bad in constraints?
I think it can be actual and fake constraints. You can use fake constraints to boost creativity. Like, imagine if you're blind, how would you design something? And that can help create something or take you on a train of thought that would make your solution into something you would never imagined otherwise. Or you could have a real constraint and then still be forced to be creative. I mean, you can use them in different ways, depending on.
I think, like, I hear what you said before, Henning, about time. I appreciate smaller sessions within the design thinking process, just to like try to get the essence of things and then just build different directions and then do smaller iterations instead. That's just my preference, because it really challenges you, especially like coming back to the duck example, you said with very few resources and you might get combinations that you didn't even imagine, as opposed to giving a lot of time and everyone might just come back to the same conclusion, but we're starting from different points. So I think that there is, I would say, like, I like that constraint. I think when it comes to bad, like, bad is, for me, can be evaluated in different ways. I would say maybe unreasonable constraints somewhere. Like, is this really fitting into what we want to achieve in the end? Coming back to maybe business stakeholders, like, a requirement might be very different from what the rest of the users actually want. So, like, that would be, for me, an unreasonable constraint in what we want to achieve with the product and the solution that we want to build. So, yeah.
I'm thinking of like a silly example of what could be like bad constraint, but it could be like if someone challenges you to make a soup without water, and you're just stuck there with all the vegetables, and maybe in your most creative mind you're thinking, well, a tomato has some water in it, and you start to use it, and I think you could get a creative outcome that eventually could become excellent, but you might not end up with the soup that you wanted, but it still fuels your creativity or inspires you to do something that you would have never thought of otherwise.
Or does it? I mean, that's awesome to actually, I mean, it's in the title of this session that it is something from the outside, but do you feel constrained by it? You know, I mean, I don't know if you touched that before, but what Henning referred to was like, he felt, and I can relate to that absolutely, that I feel constrained, and that stress puts me in a position where I can no longer be super creative. But if I don't feel constrained by the constraints, you know, like Henrik pushes out these awesome examples, you know, Maybe I would probably because of sweat. I mean, that there's water too. But anyways, I'd be super stressed. And yeah, I think that my own constraints, like oh, can I do this? Oh, this is pressuring me and stuff like that. These constraints, they can totally limit the creative process. But like an outside constraint, I think, however you take it, like what's your mindset towards a constraint? That totally changes the game, and how you put yourself into a position of being creative or being hesitant or fearful.
I just want to add a point that Melissa brought up before, which is the aspect of creative confidence. Like if that's not involved, or like if that's not cultivated from either the setting or the individuals that are like challenged to be creative, I think the stress will definitely take over. So that's also an aspect of like, how do you free up or strengthen give the right circumstances. But that's also like maybe, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to it, because it has more to do with you and your confidence rather than maybe the constraints that you have. So that's another dimension.
Yeah, I really like the thought that it's more maybe about the, like you said, environment or the culture or the mindset that you get people into when setting constraints, rather than the constraints themselves. I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I guess if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had like a follow-up question, or a question that was in my mind throughout the discussion in a way, which is related to Natalia's question, I think, is like, when do you, or how do you decide which possibly unreasonable constraint you push back on, and saying, okay, this is a constraint that like either maybe you wouldn't put that constraint yourself, but you get it externally, and then you could decide to embrace it as a challenge, or you could decide to push back on it. So how do you decide whether to push back on it, and also not just on your level and your preferences, but also on the team level, which I think you just touched upon just now, that there are individual preferences for the constraints that are limiting versus fueling the creativity.
So actually you would say you don't have to accept every constraint that is put upon you.
That's my question. Like, is there a point where you would say that's too much, or my team wouldn't be able to be creative with that? Or would you just go, all right, well, let's see what we get with that constraint, like the soup constraint, and go like, here's your tomato soup, and then let's see where we go from there, Yeah.
Actually, with the soup thing, I was more like, okay, I should rebel against that, because it just doesn't make any sense, and push it away. That was my initial feeling about that example.
You would go cook somewhere else.
Or just stop.
There was a question from Dieter in the chat.
Yeah.
Should I answer him?
Yeah, sure. Dieter can also come to stage. We have like 5 minutes maximum left until the session closes automatically. Just saying. So Dieter, yeah, he's actually already. Let's see.
So he's asking if I consider a design system to be followed as a bad constraint, and it's a relevant question for me because I work with design systems. So I obviously think it's a good asset when you're building something. It's a product that is never done. It will evolve with you as a company, but it will kind of be like a lasso that is holding back the horse a bit, so we're not racing too fast. And I think a design system is enabling both designers and end engineers to work with a constrained set of Lego pieces that are quality checked, and through that we can get more quality at a lower cost, and more quality faster, because what's really expensive is the engineer's time to build things. And by systematizing it, the things that they build are becoming more reusable, meaning that they don't reinvent the wheel as often. So very much pro that. I think it's the only way to get quality both quickly and at a low cost. but it does have a bit high starting cost. So paradoxically, but yeah. And then there's always the question: is there room for innovation given that kind of system?
Yeah,
and it is, because it saves time. So then that time can be spent partially on innovation.
Don't you think that too many constraints might? I'm just thinking like about bureaucracy in a big company. Company starts small, you have a lot of freedom, then you start to build your product. It's going to be let's say it's successful. Okay, Dieter couldn't come. And then with this growing, maturing of the company and the organization, things get more stiffened up. Actually, you are building your own constraints. Sounds like a natural process. How do you counteract that? I mean, it's also something where many companies, I don't know, maybe Nokia ran into something like that, constrained to their feature phone set instead of going for more modern stuff, and then they actually broke. How do you counteract with that? These
I think it takes a lot of guts,
system inherent,
and courage.
Just a lot of guts and
guts and courage and true conviction, or convince self that they feel convinced that it's worth doing. It's not going to be easy for anyone.
How about having rigidity and comfort as a constraint? I mean, if you point out that like everything that is alive is transforming constantly, you're like it cannot never be a business constraint officially to stick where you are, to stay where you are, to not evolve. This cannot be a business constraint. But it just, you know, like Henrik said, it takes a lot of guts to always continuously bring that point up, because there's always tendencies of things to be slowed down, or people who are afraid of stuff to change and stuff like that. But like in real life, everything that is healthy is transforming every second, like every microsecond, like every moment, you know. So a design system has to evolve. Whenever there's like when I'm a designer and I work with the design system, I'm one of the ones who is actively involved in the design system. So he needs to challenge it. That's my goal. That's my task, actually, even though nobody has written it down, but I'm actively involved in the design system. And if this design system wants to stay alive, I am the one who's going to change it, or I'm part of the people who are going to challenge that and going to change that in order to keep it up to date, in order to keep it alive, to keep it fresh, to keep it evolving. Like that's part of a design system, or should be, at least in my experience. Everything else dies like the Nokia death.
Yeah.
Oh, just in one way, Simon. So you're saying that like, since the design system necessarily doesn't have to change the way it is, but it has to continue to evolve to support the evolution and keep up with the rest of the things. Did I get that right?
Yeah. If it's been alive before, yeah, it can evolve. If it's not, if it's dead,
I think.
radically.
So me and Henrik have been working on specifically like a design system, and I think please jump in, Henrik, if you feel like I'm going into the wrong direction. But here, essentially, it frees up time for innovation and doing other things. So we're making a base and we're making assets available to play with Lego and build houses much quicker in a way. But there's also a user of this that is in another context, which is all the engineers that are going to implement it, and their environment also changes. So it's also like, as opposed to the end user, which would be like the one using the product in the end, now it's our engineers that are using a product of Lego bricks, more or less. And their landscape also changes, their constraints also changes in the way that technology evolves. So there's still things to like kind of like know about your user all the time, how they move, what they need, and how their environment is evolving as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I could add to that in the sense that when you have a design system and you try to unify the elements of your product, it's also you're really unifying the experience and expectations of your end users. I think if everyone would make their own decisions of what would happen when you click a button or click a drop down or click a search field, then the user wouldn't really find any real pattern in your product. They wouldn't be able to utilize learning one part of it in another, and they would eventually struggle to feel confident in it. They would always be a bit surprised by it. And I think that is a part of user experience and expectations, and in the end, perceived quality. I think, as a company, different companies promise different levels of quality to people. Apple promises a lot, Ryanair maybe less, and I think wherever you position yourself, your customers will have expectations based on that. So if you have discrepancies and bugs and you're Ryanair, it might be more okay. But if you're promising to be a qualitative high-end company that people pay premium for, they will be less accepting of discrepancies and bugs and perceived mistakes, and a design system caters somewhat to ensure that you do get this consistency that is perceived as also quality.
So basically you have some kind of trade-off, right? On the one hand, you have some kind of consistent design. For example, if you have already developed several software products, and you have to follow specific patterns, but on the other side, it probably narrows a little bit the creativity because you have to already build up on a given base, right? So it's a classical trade-off situation, I guess.
But what's actually cool is that when you have these components in different products from different eras in your company, and they're stemming from the same central repository of things you make, making a change to it that would strike all of your products is quite simple, which is a way to actually enable innovation, in my opinion, because you might be hesitant to make a change that would strongly separate this one product from the other, and then have to rework it on all the other ones, have the engineers go into each line of code where this specific font is used. They would not have to do that. And that is a benefit that will also be useful if you're doing a rebranding. The entire color scheme changes. That's also governed from one place. So you get a lot of automatic gains. That does still support moving forward, I think.
Thanks.
So centralism as a money saver, so to say.
Yeah, but it can really be a bottleneck as well. So it's difficult.
Any more thoughts? I will ask like that.
I think we will see more roles in the future, people for these types of functions that span across product solutions like design systems. And I think it's a trend that we've seen in the past 5 years to manifest design systems.
Okay.
And we're only in the beginning of it.
Well, what do you see as a potential as well?
Well, the potential future is that when you're systematizing everything, you're really systematizing things for us as designers initially. But as a result of that, because you've systematized something, it can be translated into logic for developers as well. So basically, I think by designing systematically, you could pretty much get your product implemented automatically in terms of when you have these Lego pieces in place, you can simply generate your design. Sounds maybe futuristic, but I don't think it's that far off.
Weren't there a few tests like a few years ago about AI-driven layouts and stuff like that? Is that what you're thinking?
I mean, what we're experimenting with is taking the sketch files, and we use the same component library in Sketch as we do in code. to then look at the sketch file, what is in here, where is it positioned, and then translate that to our code with the components that we have and see what happens. It's theoretically possible, I believe. Who knows if it will be a reality? I mean, code generation has never been succeeded, so
It's true as well.
history is against us.
Which didn't stop it.
Do you have an example where your design system is unique because of your unique product? I don't think our design system is unique at all because of our unique product. Our design system is solely unique because of its infrastructure and how Klarna has invested in it for it to be impactful in our products. It takes a lot to have one central entity affect everything. So everyone can have a design system, but to succeed in implementing it in the organization is the real challenge and uniqueness.
Yeah, organizational-wise, that is really the challenge. I was just thinking about the other constraint when it comes to design system and whether that kills creativity or not, because we already talked about the fact that it frees up time for innovation in other aspects. But the main constraint for design system is, in my opinion, established patterns. Unless you want to be bold and you are coming up with a new like interface pattern that you want to establish or explore with, but that might take a very long time and might affect more parts that you already have in your library or in the system that you have. What's your thought of that?
I mean, can I add one thing to the uniqueness? I think like one uniqueness, I think, because of our unique product is that we have a very unique expression when we are consumer facing in terms of advertising and marketing and app. But that drastically changes as we move closer and closer to user interaction. Like our app, it's black and white, very boring in comparison. And that is a strategic choice to be loud and engaging, to pierce through the noise. But then as you move towards actually being utilitarian to a user, it's very bland. It's pretty much just the information speaking for itself. So in that sense, that's I think, unique strategy, given the unique expression we have perhaps outwards. And then on the flip side, it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to also specify my question, I was coming also a bit from a unique user or user need perspective, where you're feeding or you're thinking about specific components in your design system to solve your users have in the situation your product is solving.
I'm not sure I fully understand.
Like you were talking in the beginning, which I very much liked, about we're starting with this basic set of components and we're only adding on where we see we have a lack of components. Do you have an example for your design system where that was the case because of what your product does?
I mean, we have a lot of products, but I think, I mean, the most basic case is title sizes. We did our rebranding and got a new typeface and had to define the title hierarchy pretty naively, just chose a scale between them, like the different sizes, what we thought would be enough. But then as time of using it in the product evolved, we saw that we needed much more sizes of the title, and that caused us to have to rethink a bit the what we think is like a good jump between sizes, and then how low do we need to start so that the smallest one makes sense to actually also fit how big the biggest one would be, and find a balance between that. So I don't know if that was a too simplistic example.
No, not at all. It was a good example, I think. I mean, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but I find it interesting. Everyone has a common understanding about what a design system or a pattern library can be and can be made of, but where one differs from the other, I find an interesting thought process.
I think like the uniqueness of ours is that it's broken down into like this chemical structure of atoms. It's not unique actually. A lot of people use atoms, molecules, organ. So, but it creates a distinction of what role different aspects think. And we have things like ions, which are not even a real entity in itself, like colors or like colors or sizes that are like pierced through all of the actual components, and that structure and way of thinking makes them very simple to evolve, I guess. Like if you want to change one color, it easily strikes through everything.
Can I add one question that would build upon that of Karina? Or
actually,
right?
We don't in a way, but we should in a way at some point. I think you also might want to should just continue, but let's say at 40, like in 4 minutes, we call it a day, which is not correct here, but session. We call it a session. But sure, go.
Because I was just I was quite deeply involved in building a design system, which was actually based on which was meant for expert user applications. So inward facing to the company, the inward facing side and the outward facing side of the company was a design system as well. Do you also build something for, let's say, admins or somebody like the service terminals or stuff like that? Or is it like, what's the design system for? Does Klarna build the software as well where they manage customer
we do.
and stuff like that?
The design system exists for everyone. The problem is that not all teams and product owners work with a designer or have contact with a designer, and there's a problem of reaching out with the knowledge of design systems in the organization. So plentiful of products get built without even knowing that this thing exists, simply because they're not in a position where you would be exposed to design even as a concept. You could be a very engineering heavy team where they've just built things themselves and they don't know that they should know anything else. So it's an educational aspect and organizational concern. But I mean, we want them to use it. It would improve our product quality if they did, but it's about someone needs to take the time to educate them and engage them and explain why they should do it, because there's a learning threshold for everything. It's difficult to teach especially senior or lead people to try new ways.
Maybe
without really anchoring why.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't basically want to shift the whole discussion to into the direction of design systems, but do you have maybe any experiences like specific constraints are created depending whether somehow a designer or a developer is in the lead to set up a design system?
Well, luckily I'm a computer science major, and so I'm very well at the constraints, and I most of the time push our engineers through the constraints that they see by being creative around them, simply because of my background, and I think that helps. But definitely, I think I mean, people will not be positive to building something that they don't initially see why, or that they feel like doesn't sound possible. But then when you show them how it's possible, it's likely that they'll feel like, okay, shit, we can do this, and then it gets done. it's good to have someone to meddle between the two competences.
Thanks.
Hope that answered.
And we are at the end of our time actually as well, which I put as a constraint of this session. Everyone, thank you very much for joining, asking the questions, joining the discussion, showing your pitches and everything. Join the other sessions, they're already running. There's also networking happening, like speed networking function. This hop-in is pretty fun. We just randomly connect with other people. Yeah, enjoy the day. See you soon in another session.
Thank you so much for participating.
See you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.